Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, February 8th, 2021, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And before we get into today's episode, I want to thank those of you who continue to make Talk Nerdy 100% free to download for anyone who is interested. And you do that by pledging your support on patreon.com/talknerdy, by rating and reviewing anywhere you get podcasts, and also by shopping in the Talk Nerdy store. Today's top patrons on Patreon include Michael Gaucher, Mary Neva, Leonard Prince, Christopher Pitts, June Sapara, Pasquale Gelati, Ulrika Hagman, Dudas Infinitas, Charles Payet, Brian Holden, Pedro M. Rosario Barbosa, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Robert Christ, and Elise Christie. Wow, you guys. Wow. Thank you all so much from the bottom of my heart. You really do make Talk Nerdy possible, and you help me keep this train on the tracks. All right, I've got a really great episode for you guys this week. I've been really looking forward to this one for quite some time. I'm glad we were able to finally get together, well, digitally, remotely get together to share this interview with you. So this week, I had the opportunity to sit down with Dr. Carl L. Hart. He is a psychology and psychiatry professor at Columbia University. I also just read that he was the first tenured African-American professor of sciences at Columbia. And he's also a research scientist at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. He has done a ton of research. He has also published a lot of papers, a lot of popular articles, and several books about drug use. Now, he has what I think is a common sense and evidence-based approach, what many people would call a radical or a progressive approach about common sense drug policy. And his newest book is called Drug Use for Grown-Ups, Chasing Liberty in the Land of Fear. This is a really important one, everyone. So without any further ado, here he is, Dr. Carl L. Hart. Well, Carl, thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm happy to be here, Cara. I hadn't seen you in a while, so it's good to see you virtually, I guess.
Yeah, so we met in person when we recorded. I was a kind of I guess we called them correspondent for like a year on Bill Nye's Netflix show. And you were on the show on the episode that was done about addiction. We got to sit on a panel, and that was a fascinating panel, I have to say. We were lucky enough to also have was he a police officer on the panel with us?
Yeah, he was. He was a cool guy. Yep, that's right.
He was cool though. Yeah, he was like a really progressive cop, which was, I don't know, refreshing. So it was great though to hear your perspective. I immediately went out and bought your book, High Price, and I'm really excited now to talk about your newest book, Drug Use for Grown-Ups, Chasing Liberty in the Land of Fear. So today's chat is going to be about drugs, and it's going to be about like some of the hard truths and some of the misunderstandings, and really the detriment that has occurred in our country because of the war on drugs.
Yeah, let's do it. This is my favorite subject, so let's do it.
So before we even get into some of the kind of takeaways from your book, I would love to know a little bit about your background, how you got into this, because this is actually not just an academic passion for you, but also a personal one as well, right?
Yeah, I guess you could say that. But I got involved with this because I came of age in the '70s and the '80s, and during a time when we said that crack cocaine was destroying communities like the one for which I came, and so I thought that if I studied drugs and learned something about drug addiction, maybe I could stop drug addiction, cure drug addiction, and then solve some of the problems that I thought were being caused by drugs in my community. And that's how I kind of got into this.
Right. And then as you started to dig deep, and I know that like you've worked in departments where I've never been really clear. Are you a neuroscientist? Are you a psychologist? Are you both? Neither?
Well, so I came of age, my PhD, I started in 1992. Between 1990 and 2000, that was deemed the decade of the brain by George Bush
Right.
one. And so I got a PhD in neuroscience and psychology. And
Ah,
so I'm both.
you're both. And right now, your position is in the Department of Psychology and Psychiatry at Columbia, right?
That's right. So I'm in two departments. I'm in the
Mm.
Department of Psychiatry and the Department of Psychology. And so I teach at the medical school and I teach also at the undergraduate and graduate campus.
Gotcha. And do you consider yourself more of a research scientist and professor, or have you done practice as well?
Yeah, I'm absolutely a research scientist. That's what I do. I don't see patients or have a desire to see patients. I like doing research and writing books.
Awesome. Yeah. And your perspectives, your synthesis of the available data and of public policy, of public health, is really, I have to say, a refreshing one. The only other addiction um, I guess, expert, I guess I could call her that I've had on the show up to this point has been Maya Solovitz, who's actually a journalist, but also a researcher. And she writes pretty critically about the way that we conceptualize treatment in our country. And so I think that I'm excited to dig deeper into that and to talk about where policy and evidence have not lined up and kind of what we can do about that in the future. So you mentioned at the beginning that you were kind of out to solve this problem. How are we going to treat addiction? How are we going to help people get better? And that didn't quite go the way you expected, did it?
No, not exactly. I thought the majority of people who use these drugs like crack cocaine or heroin, I thought the majority of these users were addicted, and I thought the majority were in need of treatment or help, and that they were imprisoned by the drug. And then turns out the vast majority of users of any drug are not addicted, but almost all of our attention goes toward addiction, and that sort of biased frame has led us down some really unfortunate roads. One would say, might even say, pathological roads, and so that therein lies the problem: our disproportionate focus on addiction, when instead we should just be focused on drug use.
Right. And so because drugs are and have for, a long time, certain drugs at least been illegal, I think the general public has a difficult time even differentiating that, or maybe I shouldn't say differentiating, but labeling drugs. Like, what's the difference between an illicit drug and a pharmaceutical drug that's legal but is controlled, and a drug that I can buy over the counter, and a drug that I can synthesize myself? Like, what does the word drug really mean? And why do we have these, I guess, just intense emotional responses to the way that we have labeled drugs? The way we categorize them really directly affects the emotional valence that we put on them. There are good drugs, there are bad drugs, there are drugs that help us, there are drugs that hurt us, but it's not that clean, is it?
Yeah, no, I mean, you laid it out nicely. Let's just think about it from this perspective. So I'll just say what I mean when I talk about drugs. I simply mean a substance, a chemical that alters your behavior, your mood, your thinking. That's all I mean. Now, that's what how the body thinks of drugs. It's like the body doesn't think of all of this emotionality that we bring to this situation. The body just sees it as there's a receptor for it, and it alters function or it doesn't, and that's it. The sort of emotionality that we bring to this is a human sort of thing that we do, and we do it for reasons that vary. Sometimes we bring this emotionality to the subject because we want to vilify certain users of the drug, or other times we want to exonerate certain users of the drug. So, but the body doesn't care about any of that sort of stuff. The body just wants to know, is there a receptor or not? And if there's a receptor, then it will probably lead to some alteration in function, whether that's more pleasure, whether that's a disruption of some function, but some alteration.
And so let's say that I take a drug. whether it was prescribed, whether it wasn't, whether it was illicit, whether it wasn't, all these different labels and all these different taxonomic things that we do to divvy it up. Let's just say it's drug X, and I take drug X. What is the difference now between using drug X and and addiction to drug X? What is that line in the sand? How do we define it? And are we doing it correctly?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So when I talk about the difference, I'm simply talking about the definition of addiction that has been laid out to us by the American Psychiatric Association in the DSM, or the Diagnostic Statistical Manual number 5.
Mhm.
And that definition of addiction, distinguishing it from use, is simply the drug causes some disruption in your functioning, causes some disruption such that you are unable, or you're not meeting some obligations, whether they're educational obligations, whether they are occupational obligations, whether they are just social or family obligations, and you are distressed by the fact that you're not meeting these obligations, or you're distressed by these symptoms. That's what we call addiction. Whereas we can imagine people, particularly now that we're in this global pandemic, we can imagine people who drink alcohol, wine, or what have you every night, and they don't have any disruptions. They're able to wake up in the morning and do this boring ass Zoom shit that we're all
Mhm.
having to do. But they're meeting their obligations. And so we wouldn't say that they are addicted to alcohol. The same is true with people who use cocaine or heroin. They use their heroin, their cocaine, and they're meeting their obligations. Their life is fine. But whereas you might have someone who uses these substances, and these substances disrupts their ability to meet these obligations, and then we would say that they are, and they are troubled by the disruptions, and then we would say these people are, they meet criteria for addiction, or as the DSM calls it, substance use disorder, and it would be appropriate to label them as someone who has an addiction.
Right. I guess, what do you say to the sort of what I found to be a pretty well established, maybe that's not the right way to put it, but a pretty common conception that there is you hear this a lot in sort of public discourse. Well, there's a difference between a physical addiction and a psychological addiction. Like,
Oh,
as
that's a
if there's
great
some
point.
sort of
Great point.
metric and we can measure when somebody's physically addicted with some sort of machine.
No, that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up. A drug like, for example, heroin, if someone is using that drug consistently on a regular basis, and then they abruptly discontinue their use after some extended period of use, you will see some withdrawal symptoms, some unpleasant symptoms, like they might have diarrhea, they might have various aches and pains, they might have symptoms that look like the flu upon discontinuing that use of heroin. The same is true if someone uses alcohol for an extended period of time, then they abruptly discontinue their use. They will have some symptoms that are unpleasant. The difference between alcohol and heroin is that the folks who discontinue their alcohol use abruptly and experience withdrawal symptoms, they run the risk of dying from withdrawal symptoms, and so they have to be weaned off of alcohol in a medical facility. Whereas heroin, you can be weaned off at home. You don't have to worry about really dying from heroin withdrawal, but you do have to worry about dying from alcohol withdrawal. And so that's a difference. But you can also see the same sort of thing if somebody's been taking an antidepressant for a number of months and years, and then they abruptly discontinue their use. You will see some withdrawal symptoms, some unpleasant symptoms. But we don't say that someone is addicted because of seeing these withdrawal symptoms. It just simply means that your body has compensated for the drugs you use, and now the drug is no longer there. Now the body has overcompensated, and it it's going to take a little bit of time for the body to readjust before we see homeostasis again. But that in itself does not mean that someone is addicted to a substance, because we can imagine us saying that, oh, you're addicted to your fluoxetine or your Prozac, and then it's like, no, that's not addiction. That's just a simple bodily response.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, right now I'm trying to I've stopped taking my birth control with my, gynecologist. Obviously, it was a choice that we made together, and we're monitoring symptoms. And I mean, you could say that I'm having birth control withdrawals, but I would never
Yes,
say that I was addicted to my birth control.
that's a great example. That's a perfect example. Perfect.
Yeah. I mean, that would be a ludicrous assumption for somebody to say, but it's so easy for us to go there because I think of this emotional valence and this kind of, I don't know, judgment. Do you think that's a good word to use?
Yeah, yeah. No, you're being kind with the emotional valence.
Right.
No, it's some puritanical, judgmental, moralistic American shit. That's what it
Yeah.
is. I mean, we
Yeah.
are moralistic. It's like we fear that somebody else somewhere is having fun. That's what we fear.
And you know what I where I see this, in kind of the most extreme situations. I live out here in LA. Right outside of my door, I walk my dog. And for the past couple of days, there's been an empty Narcan package on the ground. The reason I haven't picked it up and thrown it in the trash is because we're living in a global pandemic. And I don't know,
Hmm.
if the
Hmm.
person who was using it was following protocol or if it could be contaminated. But the
Absolutely.
fact that there's a utilized Narcan container on the ground gives me joy. It makes me happy that there are people in my community who have access to life-saving drugs in case if they have an overdose. The fact that there are places in the world or in our country even where people can't exchange needles, where people can't have access to, the ability to, whether it's fight an overdose, whether it's have a clean utilization, just to prevent public health disasters. The fact that people put the kibosh on that because they don't think it's what good, right, healthy. I mean, it really infuriates me.
Yeah, I'm with you, obviously. But I want to go a step further. I
Yeah.
think many of us are okay with folks having Narcan. Narcan, of course, is the opioid antagonist that will reverse an opioid overdose, or it just reverses the effects of something like heroin or any other agonist like fentanyl. It reverses the effects. That's what Narcan does. So it is used after the fact. After something negative has happened, that's when you give Narcan. So I like us to go a step further and to ensure that people have clean heroin that is pharmaceutical grade, so that we don't have to worry so much about using Narcan, because when many of the situations that require Narcan, they occur because the person didn't know the quality of drug that they possess. Oftentimes, their opioid, like heroin, is tainted with something like fentanyl, which is a lot more potent and potentially more dangerous when people don't know. So we can step in. We can ensure that they have a high quality of drug. Ensure that their drug is not contaminated with something that might be potentially harmful, like they have done in places like Spain, Switzerland, Austria, the Netherlands, in Vancouver. They are trying to get a safe supply of heroin, for example, to stem the tide of their overdoses that they're seeing that are caused from contaminated supply.
It's interesting because I'm always trying to kind of empathize with what somebody who is maybe not convinced and empathize with where they might go next. What is their response next? And I can hear like the chatter in my head almost of somebody saying, "But wait a minute, wait a minute. Okay, that's all good and fine to say that heroin, if it's pure and if it's we know the potency, that people are going to be better at dosing and that people are going to be smarter with how they use. But isn't there an opioid epidemic? And aren't the people who are mostly falling ill or dying using medical grade opium, using, the pills that they got off of because they broke their back and then they ended up either needing to buy more off of other people or, working their way up from hydrocodone to oxy to fentanyl, for example. And so I'm interested in how you would respond to that kind of a concern.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's why you have a show and I don't, but that's great. That's a great concern, and that's one that needs to be addressed. So let's just think about the notion that people are we're experiencing this opioid epidemic. So when people say that, we have to be clear in what we're talking about. Are we talking about overdoses? Are we talking about addiction? That's fine. So let's just take addiction first. We'll just break it down. If we think about addiction, the amount of people who become addicted to opioids as a result of having them be prescribed by their physicians, that number is relatively low. It ranges from anywhere from like 0.2% to maybe 8% at most. It's a really relatively low number. But that's okay. That's still some folks that we worry about, and we can definitely talk about that, and we'll talk about that. Or if we're talking about an epidemic in terms of the numbers of people who are dying from opioid-related deaths or drug-related deaths. When we look at overdose deaths in the country, I think now the new number is like 80,000 people died last year as a result of some overdose. We break that out and we say about half of them may have an opioid in their system. That is, they at the time of the death, maybe 40 to 50,000 of these individuals had some opioid in their system. Now, the vast majority of these people had multiple drugs in their system, sometimes up to like 8 drugs in their system. One of the things that we know is when you take something like opioids combined with other sedatives, it increase the likelihood of respiratory depression. That is, you might have an overdose and die. That's what we mean. And so people rarely have an overdose when they only have one opioid involved, unless they have something like fentanyl and didn't realize they had fentanyl. Fentanyl is a lot more potent than most of the other opioids, so it requires only a small amount, particularly in naive people, to produce opioids. The lesson here is that we should tell people not to combine opioids with other sedatives, particularly if they're naive, because it increases the likelihood of respiratory depression. And the second lesson is that we should provide some drug checking services where people can submit small amounts of drugs, and then they can find out the chemical composition of what's contained in their substance. That means that if it contains a contaminant, something that will likely lead to overdose, they know not to take it. But the problem is, most people just simply don't know what's in their opioid when they're buying them off the street, because most of the overdoses are occurring from street drugs, not pharmaceutical drugs. That's been shown by this woman, Sally Satel. She's a psychiatrist, and she really has delved into this question. I think she's writing a book on this, and she shows that this notion that people became addicted as a result of their doctors, and that's rare, and that's not how most people become addicted. Especially when we think about addiction, most of the people who are addicted, who meet criteria, they have co-occurring psychiatric illnesses. They have a number of other problems that were there before their drug problem. And so by us conflating this and scapegoating drugs, we're not really helping people who are in need of help.
You're right. And we're not helping them on multiple sides of the aisle. One of the things that I see quite often, so I've been doing my practicum, my second practicum as part of my PhD training. So I'm training to to become a clinical psychologist right now. And I've been working in the cancer center of a large hospital here in Los Angeles. And one of the things that I see time and time again, that I hear from palliative care physicians, that I hear from psychiatrists, and even from oncologists, is that very sick patients are afraid to take palliative medications. They're afraid to take pain relievers that they desperately need because they are in pain for fear of getting addicted. And often they'll refuse medication that could really help them because the narrative in their mind is, if I take an opiate at all, I will get addicted. And I don't want that to happen to me.
Yes, I understand it. My aunt, she was 87 years old and on her deathbed and afraid to take opioids because she was afraid of getting addicted. It's um, it's quite remarkable how we have convinced the American public that these things are bad, so bad that it's better to die before taking these things. It's nuts.
It is nuts. And you know what it reminds me of, like, the analogy that I keep coming back to in my head is like the difference between proper sex education and abstinence only education. That's what we're doing with drugs. We're giving the entire populace abstinence only education and not opening up and enlightening the knowledge that we actually have about how, if we can be informed citizens, we can make informed decisions. Instead, we're saying, all bad, don't think about it, just say no, never talk about it. And in doing that, a lot of people are getting harmed.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example of, and I think we do this because, the bottom line is that we don't trust our fellow citizens. And so we say that, well, if we say anything positive about this, this is encouraging people to go out and use drugs, and they can't handle it. Maybe you can, but they can't. And that's very dangerous in a democracy where you feel that you have the right to withhold information or privileges because you think the person can't handle this and they are an adult. So that's one of the things I wrote about. That's why the subtitle is Chasing Liberty in the Land of Free. We're all guaranteed this thing in this country as adults. We're guaranteed this liberty as long as you don't prevent other people from pursuing theirs. But really, when it comes to some activities, we say, well, maybe not liberty in that domain. When we think about prostitution, what business is it of mine if somebody wants to sell their body? That's not my business. But yet we have stepped in. What business is it of mine if somebody wants to alter their consciousness? Who am I to say what you can put in your body and can't put in your body when you are an adult and you have the autonomy to make those decisions yourself? We don't trust our fellow citizens.
It's interesting too, because we have like this one in like loophole in that system, which is that there are certain drugs we feel perfectly comfortable allowing physicians to prescribe, and then other drugs we feel are off limits. And we have these kind of very arbitrary lines in the sand for what, as a society, do we think people should never have access to? What should they have access to, but only when being watched over by a physician? And what should they have access to at any time? And it's very strange how we can almost always pick one or two examples where we're like, well, why is that in column A and not column B? And why would we even think column C should be there and not column A? It's not even internally consistent. I know that the argument here is that the columns are uh, kind of unfair, arbitrary, unnecessary, and actually cause more harm. But even within the system, we don't have internal consistency.
No, this is true. If we Let's just go back a little bit in our history. We just think about alcohol. In 1919, we passed the 18th Amendment. We banned alcohol, the sort of sales, and effectively we banned alcohol. And that was alcohol prohibition. It lasted from 1920 to 1933. And we banned alcohol in large part because the German Americans had a lock on the alcohol industry. And if you know anything about the history of that time, it was right around the time of the First World War. And so we had all of this anti German sort of propaganda in the country. So it facilitated the banning of alcohol. And then we changed our mind because we thought, as Americans, we thought that tax revenue generated from alcohol would replace the income tax. So that meant that we wouldn't have taxes on our income if we reversed the 18th Amendment, overturned alcohol prohibition. And we certainly did that with the 21st Amendment. We overturned it, and Americans did so because they thought that we wouldn't have to pay this income tax. We know that's not true. Now, but the point is that the reason why alcohol was banned was not because of pharmacology, but because of our sort of hatred of German Americans. And then we can think about the reason why cocaine was banned, because of our hatred of black people. We think about why opioid drugs were banned, because of our hatred of the Chinese people. If we think about marijuana, black folks and Mexicans, our hatred of that drove that. So when we think about why some drugs are available and other drugs are not, we can just really look at good old American racism, and that helps us to understand why some of these things are banned.
Right. And I think that that is such an important point, and it's such an important argument that you not just make in the book, but that you've been making as part of your work for some time now. That these aren't, as I mentioned, even they're not arbitrary. That was a poor word choice. They're really um, intentional systems that have been put into place to maintain power imbalances and to maintain a status quo that really does oppress Black and brown bodies in our country.
Yeah, drug policy becomes just another tool in which we can use to exercise this sort of dominance to keep people in their place. And one of the things that I tried to do with this book is just try to disrupt that using a topic about which I know quite a bit about, on. And so I thought that I would use this topic, drugs, to explore exactly what it means to be an American. And the founding document, the Declaration of Independence, where it guarantees us life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's a profound document, and people don't understand it because they make us learn it when we are adolescents and we don't know much. But it's really quite profound. It guarantees each American's life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, meaning that you can live your life as you see fit, long as you don't disrupt anybody else's ability to do the same. And then, that's in the second sentence. And then, like the third sentence, it says, governments should be created to secure these rights. And when governments fail to do that, governments should be disbanded. And when I read that now as an adult, as somebody who has been in this world for more than 50 years, I think about how profound that document is. And if we actually lived up to those noble ideas, we would really be the free country that we say we are. But we're not behaving anywhere near the promises that are laid out in the Declaration. And so I'm trying to remind people of that with this book.
Yeah. I think when we focus on the framing of the argument, which is, as you mentioned before, the subtitle of the book, Chasing Liberty in the Land of Fear, and we really talk about this argument from a liberty perspective. I think one of the again, kind of trying to conjure the devil's advocate here, I would love to know what is your response to the people who say, okay, but let's look at this downstream. Yes, my personal drug use is my own. And yes, if I want to smoke a joint while I watch a movie at night, that doesn't affect anybody else. It doesn't harm anybody else. But what about the war on drugs? And what about the cartels? And what about all of the lives that have been lost because of the drug trade? Is that not downstream my use affecting somebody else's liberty?
I don't understand how that works because I mean I don't understand the question exactly because I think about every year in this country, we lose 40,000 Americans to car accidents, for example, every year. And this has been going on for more than 30 years. Uh, Nobody's talking about banning cars. What we do is we try to enhance the safety of that activity, like we implement speed limits, safety procedures like uh, seat belts, airbags. We make sure people pass a test before they can get behind the wheel. We make sure they are of certain age. We do all of these things in order to make this activity as safe as possible. Um, but people still die. And in any sort of endeavor in which involves humans, you can expect that there will be some risk, and yeah, that might even be some deaths. But that's what we call life. I don't, and so I don't know if people would say, "Yeah, but I'm not willing to take the risk with drugs, whereas I'll take the risk with cars because I need to get to where I need to go." It's like, yeah, but you don't have the right to tell someone what they can do as long as they're not bothering you. And if they do, they use drugs, for example, and attack people, whatever. We have laws for that.
Right.
Um, so, so it's a hard one for me to wrap my head around when I start to think about it from the perspective of ensuring that people have their rights.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, I mean, the only argument that I sort of can wrap my head around, but I still think it's a moot argument, is the one about sort of funding or fueling organized crime, funding and fueling the death and
Oh,
destruction
yeah.
that comes from organized crime like
I
cartels.
see.
But
No,
then
no,
the
I
organized crime
see.
wouldn't
I
need to
see.
exist if drugs weren't illegal, right?
Exactly. Exactly. That's why I was having a hard time. That's it.
Yeah.
So what I'm arguing is that we legally regulate the
Right.
market just like we do with alcohol. Like we don't have cartels for alcohol. The cartels are a byproduct of our current prohibition on these substances.
Yeah, yeah, and it's funny because I think it's sometimes hard to see that forest for the trees when we're living, face to face with the trees. And so we have been fed a narrative that drugs are directly responsible for guns, for death, for destruction, for torture, for embezzlement, and for all of these really big federal and international crimes that really, I mean, they are heartbreaking if you think about the destructive path of certain cartels. But the part that's always missing from that narrative that we're fed is why those cartels exist in the first place.
Yeah, or if we just simply think about the destructive sort of path that our government has laid in its wake, fighting this war on drugs. I mean, at this point, right now, as you and I speak, there are more than 2 million Americans who are sleeping behind bars tonight. They're in jail. And I think about their lives. Many of those folks, many of them are there because of drugs, and their lives are ruined because of our drug laws. It's so we have to think about that as well.
Yeah, we really do. And I think that this is something that, for anybody listening to the show who hasn't yet read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. I mean, this is obviously a big part of what she talks about, that this is kind of a new era um, of rights being stripped. Of It's another way to disenfranchise Black and brown bodies in this country, is that many people are behind bars for, what we think of as low level drug crimes, non-violent offenses. And even if they're quote unquote free, but are on probation or parole, they are being controlled by the state. They have had their rights stripped away from them in many states, and they are disenfranchised by this system.
Yeah, the thing that like the folks who are proponents of the new Jim Crow or advocates or who have read that, they haven't thought deeply enough of some of them, not all, haven't thought deeply enough about this. It's like if you're going to be against this sort of mass incarceration or this war on drugs, then you have to evaluate the principles or the sort of logic on which the war on drugs is built. And it's built on this premise that drugs are bad. And many Americans, they will say that, right, I agree with Michelle Alexander, we shouldn't have this war on drugs. But at the same time, they would say, we have to rid our communities of drugs. It's like, what?
Right.
Those things are inconsistent, and they don't even realize that it's inconsistent. Now, I want to just take a step back because people have said, like, oh, certain communities are awash with drugs, particularly like poor Black community and those. So it's just simply not true. One of the things I talk about in the book is that I have had far more drug experiences in my hanging out with wealthier, privileged white colleagues. So drugs are far more prevalent in those communities, better drugs. But those communities aren't being destroyed. In fact, people are going to work, responsible members of their community. They are good people, and nobody's talking about drugs destroying those communities. And so that whole narrative has to be evaluated. So when we start talking about bringing the police in and getting drugs out, no, we should be thinking about bringing jobs, bringing better educational opportunities, all of these sorts of things, not getting drugs out. If you're focused on getting drugs out, you've already missed the boat.
Right, right. And this kind of conception that the types of drugs that exist or the way that these drugs are affecting the communities. I mean, it seems like it's a complicated issue, but the two things that stand out to me most are that it's a simple function of racism, that not just our drug policy, but that our opinions and our emotional responses to drug use are so blatantly different between, poor Black communities where certain drugs might be more prevalent and rich white communities where other drugs might be more prevalent. We actually have different feelings about cocaine than we do about crack when it's the same drug. We actually have different feelings, about let's say ecstasy, MDMA, than we might about meth, for example, when there are similarities. It's not the same drug, but there are similarities, or Adderall versus amphetamine. And then the second thing is that it seems like we want to blame the drugs, like that what should be our scapegoat. Like, oh, if the drugs were gone, these neighborhoods would suddenly transform into white suburbs, as if
Yeah,
decades and generations and centuries of disenfranchisement, racism, discriminative policies, redlining, gerrymandering, that all of these things aren't what are actually contributing to poverty in these areas.
absolutely. And I'd just like to add that it's also classism. I mean, we see this with the opioids when we think about places like West Virginia, Michigan, Ohio. A lot of poor white folks are suffering because of our drug policy. I get phone calls from parents in all of those sort of rust belt areas, and drug policy is what's destroying their kids. And these are white kids where the factories left several years ago, and now the middle class jobs are gone, and people are wondering what happened. These opiates are destroying their communities, and they're not looking at GM because GM went to another country with cheaper labor and took all of the better paying jobs, took away people's sort of standing in a community, their worth. No one's looking at GM, they're looking at opioids, and that's a mistake. And so I want to make it clear that it's race and classism, it's all sort of operating together. It's like poor white folks, poor Black folks, they're all in this together.
Yeah. I think also one of the things that is very seldom brought into the conversation, and I'm really interested in this from a more clinical psychology perspective, and philosophy and neuroscience, and kind of the places where I've put my academic interests, is that we don't often talk about why people use or why people overuse, if we want to call it that, why they in the examples that you gave earlier, even in those small examples, but the ones that become more salient to us, why people have addictions that then, make it difficult for them to have normal activities of daily living. Why did they start using to begin with? For some of us, it's fun, right? For some of us, it's exploration. For some of us, it's experiential. For some of us, it's about letting go at the end of a hard day. And for others, it's palliative, it's medicative. It's not that different for a person on the street who can have access to a drug that they can purchase than those of us who are privileged enough to go see our psychiatrist and utilize certain drugs that help us palliate our emotional pain, is it not?
Yeah, I mean, so we have to. Why do people use alcohol? I mean,
Right.
to chill, relax, to as a social lubricant for a variety of reasons. The same reason why people might use MDMA. You might want it to be a social lubricant between you and your significant other, increasing empathy or something. People understand that these things help to bring pleasure, and help to relieve some human misery. It's rational oftentimes why people do these things. It's just as rational as why do people engage in sex? Why do you think?
Because
Not just to
it
make a
feels good.
make. Yeah, exactly. It's the same thing. That's it. Humans are seek to feel better.
Right, and when humans don't feel well, I mean, I remember having this argument. I grew up in Texas, in the northern part of Texas, in a pretty very conservative community, and, as a very young person, I rebelled against these conservative values that were often being kind of imposed or taught to me, and I remember getting so frustrated as a kid, seeing somebody on the street who was panhandling, who was obviously in a bad way, and they were asking for money, and, I can't remember if it was somebody in my family or friends, but it was a common refrain was like, don't give them money. They're just going to buy a bottle with it. And thinking to myself, well, God, I would want a bottle too if I was sleeping on the sidewalk every night. Like, like there's this thing where it's like, what's the chicken and what's the egg? And I get frustrated when I hear people saying, it's the cause is the alcohol, the cause is the drugs. When it's like, well, maybe the cause is something else, and this is their way to try and get through the day. And why are we so judgmental? And why do we think so deeply that everybody would be fine if not for drugs? There's a reason that drugs do take hold in certain communities. And there's a reason that we do see problems in certain areas because those people are facing difficult circumstances.
Well, let's just be clear now. Drugs have taken hold in our sort of upper echelon communities in the country. It's just that we
True.
don't hear about it
We don't
because
talk about it.
people insulate themselves and it's not your business.
Yeah,
Whereas
because
some
they get to
other
go to
people,
really expensive rehab in Malibu, right? And you just never know about it.
yeah, but that's the small number of people. The vast majority of these folks don't need rehab. They're just enjoying themselves, right?
I guess I
But
wouldn't
people
include
with
that quote, "taken hold," then. I guess
uh,
maybe that was my mistake, is I was more speaking to places where we often have this mentality that it's a problem.
Yeah, yeah. It's a problem that they're using, or it's a problem that we see the folks who are homeless, and we think that's
Right.
drug use. Now, that's where we screw up our logic because it's like people are not homeless because of drugs. I assure you that that's not what's going on. But that's what we have scapegoat drugs to that. We've scapegoated drugs such that we don't have to deal with why they are really there. As I tried to, like I alluded to earlier, you think about these areas in the Rust Belt, and you think about the amount of factories that shut down as a result of people going to look for cheaper labor outside of this country. People were devastated who were working in those factories and they were making a decent living. They could take care of their family. If you can no longer take care of your family at that level, what do you think is going to happen? That's what's going on. And if the person happened to use alcohol or some other drug, then those things are blamed and not GM or the factory that left. They're never looked at. But those are the real reason that people are suffering.
And it's like the drug or the alcohol becomes the in people's eyes, like you said, the scapegoat, people think of it as the cause when what it really is the palliation. It's the thing that people are turning to because of the thing that happened that's making them suffer because
Yeah,
of the situation in their life. And not everybody, as you mentioned before. I'm actually, Carl, I'm really interested in why you think as a society and kind of how we've gotten to this place where we identify heroin, for example, with the junkie in a movie who is, breaking into houses to get the money to get the very next fix, and who is, just hopelessly addicted to drugs. Like, we have a caricature in our minds of what a normal or what a traditional drug user looks like for each drug too. We have a different one for crack. We have a different one for meth. We have a different one for heroin. Why is that our archetype that we go to every time?
because media images are powerful. Filmmakers, it's a cheap, easy way to tug at the viewer's heart or the reader's heart, and the reader or the viewer oftentimes doesn't know anything about heroin use. They never tried it. They don't know anything about methamphetamine use, so they you can tell them anything. In the 1930s, we said these horrible things about marijuana, that marijuana leads to matricide. You kill your parent, your mother.
Oh, yeah.
And we were believed when we said things like that. Today, you can't say that because more than half of our adults have some experience with marijuana. So you can't get away with that. But you can still get away with all of the nonsense that we say about heroin because many Americans just simply don't have experience with it. And so we believe it. That's why it works in movies, and filmmakers can be lazy when it comes to drug stereotypes. I mean, our late night shows, some of the most critical people, Stephen Colbert, Seth Meyers, these folks are pretty critical on a number of issues. But when it comes to drugs, if you just listen to anything they say about cocaine, heroin, anything, it's almost always wrong. And it's always a stereotype.
Yeah, and you're right. It really does kind of shine a light on this lack of empathy or this lack of perspective that so many people have. Like, they've never experienced it themselves personally. They might not have seen it except in these contexts that are painted in such a negative light, that it becomes a caricature. It becomes an archetype. And as you mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation, and I think it really bears repeating, maybe we could get even a little more clarity on it. Those examples are nowhere near the norm, right? Can you kind of help us make sense of the numbers a little bit? What is the predominant and main uh, drug user? What does drug use usually look like in our country versus what we see on TV?
Yeah, if we think about, I don't know, we can think about, let's think about Adderall and methamphetamine. Adderall and methamphetamine are essentially the same drug. The active ingredient in Adderall is amphetamine, and methamphetamine and amphetamine are essentially the same drug. We've done work in the lab and other people too. And when you give these drugs in double blind conditions, you see that they produce nearly identical effects. But the narratives around the two drugs are wildly different. We say a number of horrible effects that methamphetamine produces, when in fact the drug is FDA approved to treat attention deficit disorder as well as obesity, methamphetamine itself. And then we think about all of these people who are on Adderall and other amphetamines, and they're doing well in the society. And so when we have these narratives that wildly differ, it tells you that these are constructed and these are based on the users and not the actual drug itself. The same is true with heroin and morphine. Heroin and morphine are essentially the same drug. You make heroin by adding two acid groups to morphine. The Bayer Aspirin company brought that to us first in 1874, but the brain sees the drugs as the same. The brain only responds to the morphine compound. And so heroin and morphine are the same drug. But yet we have wildly different narratives about these drugs in America. In other countries, they use heroin for medicine, for pain, also for treating heroin addiction itself. And the patients who are using these things, they're fine, they're happy, all the things that you want from people. So all of this kind of tells us that we have been misled.
Yeah, I can't help but think, and I know that you can't just target one source. Obviously, these media representations are abundant, they're ubiquitous. It's in every form of media representation that you see these really simplistic caricatures of drug users. But I can't help but be really angry with the television show Cops. Because I think that that set a pretty terrible standard for so many other forms of kind of I don't know. Obviously, Cops didn't create racism, but Cops, like, put it on everybody's screen in a way that was so it was like, "Hey, look, we're peeling back a curtain to a world you don't know," but it was so selective, and it was so, um discriminatory in how they did it. Like, that's where the idea in my head of, like, a poor black woman, on methamphetamine, like, acting crazy would come from. Like, that's the horrible, image I would get.
Yeah, no, cops certainly did a fair amount of miseducation as it relates to drugs. But you don't need cops. You can just look at any movie that talks about drugs, any movie. And this is probably more dangerous when it's subtle and when it's just a matter of fact and it's not the necessary focus of the film. But any movie you will see, they will vilify a drug and its users, and it will be something that is unjustly done in a way that's inconsistent with the evidence. And so, as a homework to your listeners, just look at a movie, and if they talk about drugs, see how the drug is portrayed. Now we've kind of turned a corner with marijuana. It used to be marijuana was always portrayed as some adolescent acting person on the couch eating Cheetos or nachos or something, and they were irresponsible. That's kind of changed with marijuana, and we've gotten a little better. But for other drugs, it's still adolescent in how we look at this. It's quite remarkable.
It's true, and it almost reminds me, in some ways, and not to obviously minimize, uh, it's an analogy in my head that I hope it plays out well as I say it here. But it reminds me a little bit of one of my favorite MLK quotes when he wrote his letter from a Birmingham jail, and he was basically saying that he's less concerned. It's not really the Klanner that worries him as much anymore. It's the white moderate. And in a way, it's like the power of the well intentioned people, the power of the people who are relatively progressive in their thinking, like the Colberts, like a television show like The Wire, which actually contains so much important social commentary, to also fail in this regard. In a way, it's more insidious.
Yeah, I mean, like The Wire, that's one of the things that really frustrates me more than anything because the only persons who they show using drugs is the character who pushes the shopping carts.
Mhm.
And he
Almost.
has a problem. Yeah, he has a problem. And that's the viewer thinks of drug use from that person's perspective. And they think that's what heroin use is all about. And so that's where yeah, I have a real problem with that. I love that show as entertainment, but when I learned, like, I traveled all over the world, and then people say, "Oh yeah, we're teaching The Wire," and I'm just like, "Why?" It's fiction. That ain't reality. That ain't how the hood really works. But people think that's what happens in the hood. It just blows my mind.
Yeah, to a lot of people, especially suburban, Americans who have never, gotten outside of their comfort zone, who have never spent time in these kinds of communities, like where there are people who look different from themselves, there are people, who come from different places than themselves. To them, The Wire is, quote, the realest thing they've seen.
Wow. I feel sorry for them and us because that kind of perspective, we are affected by that perspective, and uh, yeah, it would be nice if we could just say you need to get out more, but I know it's a lot deeper than that.
Well, and I guess that's kind of the question as we come to the end of our conversation here, and hopefully I can just steal you for a couple more minutes. But I think maybe the most important question to ask, since we are running really low on time, is where do we go from here? How do we affect change with something that requires such a monumental paradigm shift?
Well, one of the things that I ask people to do at the end of the book, middle class, privileged people who use drugs, and most of us do, some form of drug that is forbidden. Get out of the closet about your drug use, whether it's on a small scale to your personal circle, your friends and families, or whether it's on a larger scale. But get out of the closet. And then if we have enough people getting out of the closet, one of the things that we will see is that our caricatured view of drugs is inaccurate. And it's just that, a caricature. And hopefully that means that we will be less likely to vilify other people for simply using drugs. And hopefully it means that we will be willing to stand up on behalf of people who are going to jail for simply just doing what now the state of Oregon said that you will no longer go to jail for. The state of Oregon in November voted to decriminalize all drugs, meaning that no one will go to jail for possessing or using drugs. And that's an important step in the right direction.
Absolutely. Well, Carl, I'm gonna stand up right now then. I'm not physically standing up, but I will do what you just asked. And I will say to all of my listeners, many of them might already know this, but some of you might not, that I have done so many drugs in my life, from marijuana to MDMA to LSD to ketamine to I don't even know what. I've tried so many different things, dextromethorphan, um, that it was, I think, a really important part of my identity development, my development. I actually gained a lot through my experiences with drugs, socially, introspectively. I grew a lot. Drugs were quite good to me. They were a big part of my, youth. And or later adolescence, early college years. And I think I benefited from them. And you're right, we don't hear that story enough. So, um, maybe I'm contributing a little bit to the cause. Hey, before we wrap it up, Carl, I was hoping that I could ask you the same two questions that I close every podcast episode with.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Awesome.
But
Before we
when
do them, is there anything
you came out of the closet, you can ask me anything. Absolutely.
is there anything else that you wanted to make sure that we hit, or anything we didn't touch on before we kind of close it up?
Yeah, yeah, I just want to thank you for having me. It's been a
Oh, yeah, of
delight. So
course.
yeah,
Oh my gosh. Yeah, of course. No, I've been like wanting to get you on the show for ages. So I'm glad we finally did this. All right. So big two questions. They're sort of big picture. And I want you to answer them in whatever context is really relevant to you right now. So when you think about the future, whether it's personal, global, cosmic, whatever just speaks to you. Number one, the first question is, what is the thing that keeps you up the most at night? What are you most concerned about? Maybe even a little pessimistic, borderline cynical. What are you not looking forward to? And on the flip side of that, so we do end on a slightly kind of less downer note. Where do you have genuine optimism? What are you actually truly looking forward to?
yeah, they're related. So the thing that keeps me up at night, stressed about, is that I really worry that Americans will decide that they don't want to be a country that promises people life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. happiness, that they would much prefer to live in a totalitarian society. And that really began to worry me during the Trump years, and it has simply increased. And so that keeps me up at night. That really does. And the thing that makes me optimistic is related to that. One of the things that has happened with the release of this book is that there have been a large number of people who have contacted me about their desire to live in such a society that guarantees us this liberty. And they are here to fight for our liberty. And not in a way that those people did on January 6th, where you want to take away other people's liberty. No, in a way to guarantee the broadest numbers of people their liberty. And so I've been encouraged by the hundreds of emails that I'm receiving of all of these folks who they range the political spectrum. They're Republicans, Democrats, Libertarian, and they have said things like they've been forced after reading this book to reevaluate what they believe and to evaluate whether or not they are living according to those principles. So that's been encouraging. So um, it's really about liberty. I'm excited that we have a large number of Americans who want to ensure that others also have liberty.
Oh, as am I. Well, everyone, the book is Drug Use for Grown-Ups, Chasing Liberty in the Land of Fear by Dr. Carl L. Hart. Carl, thank you so much for joining me on the show. It was really, really eye-opening.
I feel the same. Thank you. It's always good to talk to you.
Absolutely. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.